Thank you very much for joining us today and welcome to the Catalysr podcast. I'm Chelsea, I'm here with Viv and our very special guest today, Desh Amila. Desh is an entrepreneur, entertainer and educator who is on a mission to educate, entertain and enhance the lives of those he connects with. He spearheaded the events, hip hop and entertainment industries, founded 2 charities and launched one of Australia's most influential events companies, Think Inc. And more recently, in 2018, This Is 42. Over his career, he's been responsible for hosting world-class events with internationally recognized educators, thought leaders, and scientists such as Dr Neil Degrasse Tyson, Dr Jane Goodall, Dr Brian Greene, just to name a few. Most recently, he produced and co-directed the documentary film Islam and the Future of Tolerance, which is out right now on all digital platforms. Desh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
You're welcome. Thanks for achieving so much so that was possible. Yeah, I don't think you've done enough in your life, let's be honest. No, tell us, how's your day? How are you going?
It's been a long day, but it's been a fulfilling day. It's been a day of creation. So you got me on a good day.
That's lucky. I would hate to see one.
We all feel so blessed.
So very good. So tell us, Desh, where did you grow up and when did you come to Australia?
I grew up in a place called Badulla in Sri Lanka, in the hill country. And I got a scholarship, which then gave me the opportunity to go to Colombo. If you know Sri Lanka, most people seem to know Colombo. And from there, I finished my high school and got very lucky and came to Australia in 2000.
2000?
Yes.
Yep. And how old were you when you came here?
19.
Young. Super young.
Yeah, I came here as a teenager, so my entire adult life I've lived in Australia.
Wonderful. And what were your first impressions? Like, how did you find?
So for me, it was quite challenging because I've never been on a plane, let alone been in another country, and the West is something that I've only seen on television ads. For me, New Zealand was Anchor, the milk company. Australia was Vegemite. That was like, the competitor for Marmite. So that's all I knew, and I knew that it was this strange place. I've never been, to the country. So when I came here, the whole thing was confusing because I thought I understood English. Then I came here and I had no idea what's going on. I couldn't speak English. I realized that because over there I studied in Sinhala, which is my mother tongue, and we had a subject called English, and I tend to always get good marks. But I realized I couldn't really speak the language. So coming here was, first few years were probably the most challenging years of my life.
Is there a particular moment where you realized this is just so hard? Like was there like a language barrier?
Yeah, I mean, it was, so for me, when I was in Sri Lanka, studies-wise, I did okay. I was never the first in the class, but I was in the top 5. So, I've never been in a place where, education was like really challenging. I knew what I had to do. I remember going to my first lecture and not understanding a single thing the lecturer said. And I realized I didn't even have the language to ask the next person, or the social class for that matter, to ask what's going on. And I opened up my first tertiary book and I barely understood what was there. One of the first things I did was get a dictionary, but it was an English dictionary, so I needed something to read that.
Seems like a comedy there.
Yeah, it was. I was, but from where I came from, I didn't have a way of thinking, well, this is not going to work, I'm going to go back, because, I had a one-way ticket, more or less. I had to make it work. So, from the first 3 years of Australia was the hardest that I've ever had, in my life.
Yeah. And how did you kind of push past it? When was the moment where it started to get easier?
Probably about 2014, so about 14 years later. That's when things started. I would say, okay, now it makes sense of what I've been doing for the last 14 years. It took a very long time. And again, one of the reasons for that is, so my mum and dad, they're both school teachers. Government servants in Sri Lanka means, they're on what? They earn about $150 a month. $200 a month. So this whole, my idea of coming to Australia was a very, very big mission. It was, it was almost impossible. So I didn't have a backup. Once I made my mind up to come here, and they literally bought me a one-way ticket and gave me a small amount of money to say, well, good luck, this is what you want to do. I had no way of doing anything other than making it work. So, yeah.
And you got into the music industry.
Yeah, that was an interesting turn of events. Because when I was in Sri Lanka, I was interested in radio, and I had an opportunity in 2004 to help a mate of mine in Melbourne who hosted a radio show on a station called Sin FM. S1E1.
I know Sin.
Yeah, I mean, I was there at the relatively early stages of Sin FM, and I co-hosted the show, and I enjoyed it so much. Then I applied for my own show, which then eventually led to a successful show, then partially program managing, and creating a Wednesday night, which was a hip hop night, and then a Saturday night, which was sort of R&B night. So I was there for a while, and that's how I eventually got to the events industry.
Right.
Yeah.
Then you had the foresight to do a rave night, and then it could have been.
Yeah,
was there a rave night?
I've been I know you mentioned Neil Degrasse Tyson and some of the intellectuals, but I've worked with everyone from Proof of D12 to Naughty by Nature to I've supported events that Chris Brown and things like that. So and I've run underage events. I've run nightclubs. I've been really dabbling in that for many years before I sort of found my niche.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that sort of unifies migrapreneurs when they come over, or just migrants generally, is the experience that they have when they come to Australia. And in particular, there are some sticky social issues that could come up. Were there any that affected you as you were going through that 14 years of training period?
I had.
And how did you kind of push through them?
So the main challenges were my English, because I couldn't necessarily, and I was hosting a radio show with broken English. And back then, up until relatively recently, Australian audiences aren't used to hearing somebody with an accent, and because I learned English over here, my accent itself was a strange one, so people couldn't necessarily put me into a category because they don't see me, they just hear my voice. But the music I picked to play, it was very contentious, purely because Aussie hip hop at one point was primarily just white rappers, and there was this movement called Aussie hip hop had to sound like a certain way. So anyone who rapped in sort of an American accent was shunned upon, and I didn't know that. So when I started my show, I used to play the Aussie raps, like Hilltop Wood's first album. At the same time, I would play rappers who sounded American. And then I got a lot of hate, and the hate was directed at my perceived race rather than what I was doing. I had, when I was doing radio, I had a lot of racism. I had no idea what I was getting at. I even had death threats, because I hosted a show called 100% Oz, which was just Aussie hip hop. I was this weird accented guy who was into Aussie hip hop, who was playing, this concoction of Aussie hip hop that pissed off a lot of people who were in their own camps. And they took onto forums back then. They sent text messages to the station, called the station. It was fun time. But I just took it on the chin. I was like, this is what you have to do if you need to get around. So, yeah.
And do you feel that initial shock of having to do something a bit more controversial has inspired you in your later ideas and the later things that you've done down the line?
Never thought of it that way, but I think the idea, I think so because I've faced this kind of sort of opposition, and I've come out of it, in my eyes without any major issues, and sort of I would like the idea of pushing the boundary a little bit more, and definitely.
Awesome.
Speaking of pushing the boundaries, so you're obviously in the business of bringing together some big world leaders, thought leaders. A lot of the time they have very polarized views, Like at the moment, there's an event that's coming up very shortly with Roxanne Gay and Christina Hoff Sommers, right? Tell us a little bit about, that bringing those two different people together, and tell us why that kind of thing might be considered a little
In other words,
controversial.
tell us how you mixed oil and water and somehow managed to make gold.
That's right.
Well, I mean, it's like this. We live in a world that is, people consume content through social media, and this is curated social media. Whether people like to admit it or not, you're basically getting what you are cornered into an echo chamber, which the byproduct of that is we are more and more tribal as we move forward. So we feel like everyone in our circle agree with us, but that's not the reality. The reality is there are opposing views, and when we see that, what you see on social media, people just attacking people, right? And we've kind of lost the art of conversation. And in the last few years, I've been very interested in figuring out a way, how do we bring back proper conversation? So in the light of the Me Too movement, there were a range of incidents happening that confused me. And I was like, okay, so what is feminism? To a point where feminism, the term, is used as an insult. I'm like, well, I like to call myself a feminist, but then it's also used as an insult. So I thought, rather than me trying to figure it out, let me ask some of the leading feminists in the world. So I approached Roxane Gay and said, hey, you have a certain point of view about feminism, but so does Christina Hoff Sommers, but they don't seem to gel with each other. I said, I know you disagree fundamentally with each other, but I realize you've never met each other and never had a conversation. If I provide a platform, would you do it? And they agreed. So that's where it came from.
Yeah, wow. And has there been like an incident and two guests that you've brought together where things have become like so incredibly heated, or has it always been quite contained?
I think this event we might see. Look, I have no intention of creating sort of like a CNN style, shouting match with two people. I'm not, that is not. I want to create conversations that progress somewhere. The movie I made, Islam and the Future of Tolerance, is about progression of conversation. But there was an interview Roxane recently did where she did call Christina Hoff Sommers a white supremacist, which means that she holds relatively strong opinion. I am hoping on stage in a long format they can potentially help us understand they have a lot more in common than sort of opposing views. So I haven't had any major challenges just yet, because most people, when we are one-on-one, we tend to be a lot more civil. When we're behind a screen or behind a wheel is when we kind of lose our humanity and we sort of otherize a group of people and sort of...
When we're anonymized.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you mentioned your film,
Yes.
Islam and the Future of Tolerance. Tell us a bit more about it.
So Islam and the Future of Tolerance is really a movie about conversation. I picked a very simple subject, Islam. Obviously, it is generally considered just the virtue of geopolitical issues since 9/11. It is just people don't want to talk about it, but it has created an even bigger problem where people have hijacked the conversation, and especially on the right, the far right, they've really hijacked that conversation, and to a point where you cannot even talk about this, and the left, who are progressive and well-meaning, have more and more gotten to the point we can't talk about this. The moment you talk about it, you are labeled. So I managed to do a tour with Sam Harris, and we got to know Majid Nawaz. Sam Harris is a world-famous author, neuroscientist, and an atheist. Very vocal atheist. Was part of the New Atheist movement. And Majid Nawaz is an ex-Muslim extremist who went to jail for his activity. He was a global leader of Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is a banned organization in many places. These two people met and clashed, but eventually figured out a way to have a conversation that progressed. And when I heard that story, I was like, this is amazing. How did you guys manage to do it? Let me document it. And that took us a little while, but we eventually managed to get the story, and that's what the movie's about.
Brilliant. And we can see that online at the moment.
Right now, it's available through all the streaming platforms: iTunes, Google Play, Vimeo, Xbox, PlayStation, whatever streaming platforms you have.
Yeah.
It will eventually, probably by March, April, end up on a platform, Netflix, Amazon, CNN Docs, or somewhere.
Great.
That will sit there for a little while. But it is available right now. You can purchase it.
Check it
A
out.
platform near you.
Yeah, a platform near you, in your pocket.
I think it's so great that, in all the work that you do, you're about, people progressing conversations and moving past, their, what divides them. Has that been sort of like a bit of a mantra for you in your life?
Yeah, I mean, I had to learn how to adapt. I was in Melbourne for a while, and then I had to come to Sydney. I was in different industries. Wasn't necessarily my life mission per se. I've always had a soft spot for education, but I personally had to really adapt. And I had to sort of work with people that I fundamentally disagree with. I realized after a certain point, the only way to progress is to have a conversation. Conversation is the key. And when I sort of worked that out, I wanted to do more things to help people have better conversations, help people to sort of understand each other. Like all the mention of the charity work you mentioned is because I come from a place where for 28 years we had a civil war. There's two groups fundamentally disagreed with each other, and it led to a civil war. I've never known Sri Lanka outside of a country of war. So all the work that is done is in the name of reconciliation, is letting people meet each other so they can have a communication and so they can move forward.
That is incredible. The boy who can understand his first lecture is now quoted as saying, "I'm just here to move conversations forward, you guys."
Amazing. Yeah. If there was a gem of advice that you could leave for somebody who was like you when you first got here, when you were 19 years old, what would you leave them with?
This is something I've been thinking about a lot. Is I actually want to do the reason that I'm here and the things I'm doing right now is I want to be the voice the 19-year-old me didn't have, because it's very confronting to come into a foreign country there. Every bit of customs and everything about that country is so different. But what I want to say really is. Spend more time trying to try to understand where you are. Just invest that time to understand what makes this country run. Like, what do people do? Like, I didn't really watch Australian television or anything like that because it didn't make any sense to me. If I'm telling my old self is, spend that time, read the Australian newspapers, watch the television that makes no sense to you, but try to understand so you can understand why would somebody say a certain thing, because you might be like, that makes no sense, why would you do that? But if you have an understanding where they're coming from, that is one of the things that I would definitely tell my old self.
Absolutely. And then it helps you find a middle ground as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I think one fun one before we tidy up. Sure. As a former radio host, this is probably a very interesting question. It's probably the question you've mulled over the entirety of your life. If you could take credit for a song, which song would it be? So you could take credit for any song. Right. It'd be your song.
My song.
It'd be your song. It'd just substitute in Tupac for your name, and that's it. That's you. You don't have to change the actual song. It doesn't have to be sung in your voice. Just
right. If I were to take, that's a interesting question.
It's a tough one.
Is it the one you would have gotten hate mail for? So then you could say at least the hate mail is justified because it at least was my song.
It's funny that you mentioned Tupac. I'll tell you a song, but I'll tell you something else. Some of the hate mail I got was people who were really into sort of Australian sounding hip hop. Was in a forum, somebody took a photo of Tupac, put a turban on, and put my name on it, and because they thought I was Indian. And I remember, they had like, this is what Desh probably looks like. I remember that. So Tupac and I have an interesting history in that sense.
I'm sorry to bring out those demons.
No, but you mentioned Tupac. So I would say...
legit, make that my Facebook profile. That would be amazing.
I would probably say... Man.
I usually find it's the first one that comes to your head. So if there's one that immediately popped into your head, like if it was Barbie Girl, then it's definitely
Yeah.
Barbie Girl.
That's yours, though, isn't
That's
it?
yours.
That's mine
yours.
every day.
It is going to be an odd one. Warrior by Outlandish.
Outlandish.
Okay.
Yeah. Look it up.
I
Look it up.
will. A bit of context about the song, though.
So Outlandish is my favorite music group. They're a Danish group made out of somebody with a Mexican heritage, an Afghan heritage, and a Pakistani heritage. But they're born and raised in the West, and they sing, rap in different languages. And that music spoke to me, and it's sort of hip hop and R&B style. And this particular song is about, we worry about so many things, but there's a warrior within us. It's just a beautiful way of telling a story. That song generally speaks to me.
Fantastic.
You were expecting something a lot more simple, I think.
I just wanted support for Barbie Girl. I just wanted a +1.
Yeah, as I was talking, I was like, I should have picked a simpler song, but...
No, it's amazing.
that's
It's quite fitting that a migrapreneur like yourself chooses other migrapreneurs as his inspiration.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's a really good symbol of how this conversation has made me feel. I've come away feeling, incredibly inspired, and and I thank you so much for sharing your stories with us today, Desh.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I feel privileged that you guys did invite me.
Oh,
It's a pleasure to have you.
anytime. Yeah,
Great.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Hey team, thanks for tuning in to that podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Catalysr. Catalysr is an award-winning pre-accelerated program for refugees and migrants who wish to start their own startup.
If you're interested in applying for the Catalysr program, you can head to the website catalysr.com.au, find out a bit more about what we do. Thanks so much for tuning in.